Welcome. Here we are, Decimal Fractions, Unit 3. Let's begin. The first thing we want to do is convert a decimal to a fraction. If you're doing this without a calculator, all you have to do is remember that if I go one place over from the decimal, this is 2/10. 2 places over, this is 24/100. That's how we say it. And to convert it to a fraction, that's actually how you write it. So you would take 0.24 and you would write it as 24, and since there's 2 decimal places, we write 2 zeros. So 24 over 100. And then you have to reduce this fraction. So 4 goes into 24 evenly, so I would divide the top by 4, and I would divide the bottom by 4. And then when I do that, 24 divided by 4 is 6, and 100 divided by 4 is 25. That is the decimal, 0.24, converted to a fraction and put in lowest terms. To do it on your calculator, make sure your calculator is on, and you go in and you type in the decimal, 0.24, and hit equals. Now this calculator automatically puts your answers in fractions in lowest terms, so it tells you the answer. 0.24 is 6/25. To convert a mixed number into a decimal, we have to do something a little bit differently. To do it by hand, you would take the fraction part of it, and you would take the numerator, the top, and you would divide it by the denominator. So you would do 4 divided by 5. Now if you do that in your calculator, 4 divided by 5, it's going to give you the fraction because it defaults to a fraction. So showing you how to do this in your calculator, let's just do the whole thing at once. If you're doing it by hand, you do 4 divided by 5, and then you add 18 to that decimal. To do it in your calculator, you make sure you use the mixed fraction, so you hit Shift, and then you hit the mixed number button. So I've got my 3 boxes. Type 18, do the arrow over to get to the top, 4 in the numerator, 5 in the denominator. When you hit equals, it's going to turn it into an improper fraction, but I want it as a decimal. So I'm going to use this button, this SD button. That says convert it from fractions to decimals. I'm not sure why it doesn't say FD, but it doesn't. So 18 and 4/5 as a decimal is 18.8. So the 18 doesn't change. 4 divided by 5 is 0.8. Next, let's look at negative numbers. When we multiply or divide negative numbers, we count the number of negatives in the problem. If there's an odd number of negatives, then the answer is going to be negative. Now, this is only true for multiplication and division. If it's an even number of negatives, the answer is going to be positive. So if I was doing this problem by hand, I would multiply the top of this fraction first, and so I would do -5 times -4. That's an even number of negatives, so the top is positive. And I would say that's 20 divided by -10. And then I would do 20 divided by -10, and that is a 2 divided by 1, but I have 1 negative, so that equals -2. Now, to do the same thing on your calculator, what's extremely important is that you pay attention to parentheses anytime you enter in anything with a negative. Even if you don't think it really matters, always type it in exactly the way you see it. So I'm going to type parentheses, negative, the negative is right here, not a minus sign, -5, close parentheses, open parentheses, -4. Now, I forgot to hit my fraction button, but I can highlight this, I think. No, I don't think so. So I'm going to have to actually go back and start over. I'm just going to delete the -4. I'm going to use I'm going to delete the whole thing, and I'm going to make my fraction, and then I'm going to do it again. So -5. Because both of those are in the top of the fraction, I want to make sure I type it in exactly the way it looks. Because order of operations is very important, and if you type it exactly the way it looks, you know it's going to do the order of operations correctly. So that gave us the same answer, -2. Next, let's look at rounding. You have to do a lot of rounding in this section because there's a lot of times you deal with decimals and they have large numbers. So if I look at this number right here, 10,547.395, the answer is different depending on how much I round it to. So if I say round it to 2 places, I'm talking about round it to 2 decimal places. Right now, it has 3 decimal places. So if I want to round it to 2 decimal places, I'm going to take this 395 and I'm going to look at the 9 and the 5. And I'm basically going to draw a line between the 9 and the 5. And I look at this 5 and I say, is this 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9? It's 5, so I round up. What it means to round up is we take the number next to this and we add 1 to it. So adding 1 to 0.39 makes that this is a 9 plus 1 is 10. So if I add 1 to that, I get 0, carry the 1, and I get 0.4. So 2 decimal places is 10,547.40. The 10th place, I do the same thing where I draw a line where I want it to be. If I'm going to round it to 1 decimal place, I draw a line after that 1 decimal place and I look at this number. Since this number is 5 or larger, that means I round up. So I add 1 to the 10th place, to the first decimal place there. 3 plus 1 is 4. If I say to the nearest unit, that means the nearest whole number. And so now I'm going to draw my line at the decimal point. So I'm going to draw it between the 7 and the 3. So if I have 7.395, and I draw my line between the 7 and the 3, and now I look at this 3, it is not 5 or larger. That means all I do is I round down. And when we round down, we're cutting off, and we just leave the number the same. So that's a 7. And so this is an example for all the rest. Now let's do an example like you see in your practice. 27.32 minus 6.972 equals. Again, your calculator always gives you a fraction. You just hit the SD button. It'll change it back to a decimal. So this is 20.348. It says round to 2 decimal places. So I come over and I put my line between the 4 and the 8. 8 is 5 or larger, so I add 1 to the 4. So rounding to 2 decimal places, I get 20.35. Okay, let's do a more complicated one. Now again, it's very important to type this into your calculator exactly the way you see it, and your calculator knows what to do. Now notice that I have these little exponents here, and so I need to show you how to type those into your calculator. First we'll do 11.17, and that is raised to the 2nd power, or squared, and notice this button, x squared, there's a little 2 right there. If I push that, I just get the 2, which is what I want, times 5.10 minus 5.97. Now this is raised to the 3rd power. There's no, there is a to the 3rd power button, but I just want to show you, you don't have to use that. You can use this one, so where it makes a little box. And when it makes the box, you can put any power you want up there. So I'm going to say raised to the 3rd power, and then I have to do a little arrow to move out of the exponent. So I move it to the arrow, and then I divide by 2.17. And I say equals, and it gives me my answer, 538.2678541. I only want 1 decimal place, so I want it right to this decimal place. So I draw my line between the 2 and the 6. 6 is 5 or bigger, so I increase that number by 1. So my answer is 500, my answer here, just once. My answer is equal to 538.3. Okay, let's look at exponents. So I just mentioned exponents. The important thing that we need to talk about with exponents, I actually had most of this slide before, but I didn't do a video for it, and that is that they only act on what they're touching. So if I have -5 squared, only the 5 is raised to the second power, so I have 1 negative and 2 5s. When it's in parentheses, I have 2 negatives and 2 5s. Now why does this matter? It matters because remember, if I have an odd number of negatives, my answer is going to be negative. So this one's -25. 5 times 5 is 25. If I have 2 negatives, my answer is positive. It's a positive 25. So your best bet is make sure if there's parentheses in your problem, you put parentheses in your calculator. So the first one, there's no parentheses. I do a negative sign. 5 squared equals, I get -25. The first one, there is parentheses. The second one, there is parentheses. I say parentheses, -5, raise the whole thing to the second power. It's positive 25. Now let's do this last one here that's an actual practice problem in your book, and that is -8 squared divided by -16. Now, I know some people are tempted to count the negatives, and they say there's only 2 negatives here, so it should be positive. But since the -8 is raised to the second power, there's actually 3 negatives. 2 negatives in here and 1 more negative there. So my answer is negative. It's -4. Next, we're going to look at radicals. Okay, so if I raise something to the second power, I'm saying 2 times 2, 2 squared is 4. Well, if I have this 4 and I want to undo that, I say what times what equals 4? 2. Then I'm taking the square root. The square root says what times what equals 4? 2. What times itself equals 4? That's the square root of 4. It's undoing squaring. Similarly, if I know 2 to the third power is 8, 2 times 2 times 2 is 8, then if I want to undo that, I say what times itself is 8, and the answer is 2. I take the cube root of 8. Cube root of 8 is 2. So the square root button is right here on your calculator. It's a square root with a box, and if I put a square root of 4 in there, I get 2. The cube root button is in that shift. You can see it right there. And so I do shift, and I hit that button, and I have a cube root of 8, and I do that. I get 2. If you want to do any root, you can see it's up here, but you guys won't do that in this course. Next, we need to remember that radicals act like grouping symbols. So you have to do everything inside the radical first. Now with this calculator, that's not that hard. So let's do the first one. I take the square root, and then I type it exactly the way it looks. 17 squared minus 13 squared. Your calculator automatically puts it inside the square root. If you don't have a calculator like this and it has parentheses, you have to make sure that you close parentheses. Now this gives you an answer with the radical, but I want a decimal. So again, I'm going to hit this SD button to get the decimal. And I should have asked you to round it to a certain number of decimal places. So let's round it to 2 decimal places. So I come over here, I count 2 decimal places, I draw my line between the 5 and the 4. The 4 is less than 5, so I just cut all that stuff out, and I just write it the 2 decimal places there. So this equals 10.95 if I round it to 2 decimal places. Let's do the next one, again following order of operations. So this time I want to do the cube root, so that's the shift square root button, and then I type it just the way I see it, 7 times 8 minus 11, and I hit equals, and again I didn't tell you how much to round it to. Let's round it to 1 decimal place. Since 5 is bigger, it's 5 or is almost, it needs to be 5 or bigger, so since it is, I round up, so I go 3.6. Now, I'm not quite done, and I promised 15 minutes, and it's 14 minutes and 40 seconds now. I'm going to stop this video, and I'm going to do a part 2, which will cover scientific notation, and more scientific notation, and doing a couple of word problems. So look at part 2 for the rest of these. Thanks a lot.